So now I'm going to remind you how to solve an inequality. And for the most part, it operates pretty much the same way as solving an equation. So if you pretend for a moment this greater than or equal to sign doesn't exist, you might say that it's just an equal sign. And if it were, you would know exactly what to do, I hope, anyway, because we just reviewed equations. You would want to isolate the variable x, and you would do that by using inverse operations. So typically what most kids do, even though there is more than one right way to do it, you'll probably decide to get rid of the -2 first. And the way you're going to get rid of that -2 is by doing a +2. And just like an equation, with an inequality, what you do to one side, you have to do to the other side. Imagine that invisible line we've talked about kind of goes right there through the sign. So if I've added 2 to this side, that means that -2 will be canceled out. That means that 10 plus 2 is now going to be 12. And that means that I'll bring down the negative 2x. And because that 2 sitting next to the x means that you are multiplying, you want to cancel out that multiplication by dividing. So you're going to divide both sides by -2, because that is the number that you're multiplying by x. What you do to one side, of course, you have to do to the other. So what would normally happen with the equation is that this would cancel. You'd be left with x. Now, what I'm about to write in red is not actually correct, so I'm just using an example for a second. What would normally happen in an equation is you'd say x is equal to 12 divided by -2, which is -6. But of course, this is not an equation. We're solving an inequality. So instead of putting the equal sign there, you're going to look back at the original symbol, and the original symbol was a greater than or equal to symbol. But then there's also that rule that we've talked about previously, which is if you have to divide by a negative number, which in this case we did, right? We divided by a -2. That means that you have to flip the inequality symbol. So it's not going to be -6 is greater than x. It's going to be -6 is less than x. And then the way that this Google form works, because it's the only way you can self-check, you've only got to put in one right answer. Technically, this is correct, guys, okay? Like, this is technically right, but the Google form won't take it that way because you can only do it a certain way for it to count it as correct. So the x has to be on the left-hand side. Now, what people would normally do is put the x over there, the -6 over there, and then they would just copy the less than or equal to symbol down. But you have to keep in mind, remember, like, let's look up here. The alligator was eating the x, right? Like, we've talked about that too. And in this case, in your final answer, that's why I wrote it in red, because it's not correct. The alligator is not eating the x anymore. It's turned its back. So if you have to flip the inequality symbol to make your answer correct, make sure you flip it back in the other direction so that it's actually eating the x like it should be in the answer. So what you need to type into the Google form, so again, even though this answer up here is correct, because the Google form will only count it right if the variable is on the left-hand side, you have to make sure that the little alligator is still eating the variable because it was eating the variable up in the original answer. So what you need to type into the Google form is x is greater than or equal to -6. In this example, it's still going to be very similar to an equation. You're going to do what you would normally do if this were an equal sign instead of an equation. And instead of an inequality, sorry. And even though there are other ways to still do this correctly, what most people are going to do first is distribute that -2 to the v minus 3. So that's what I'm going to do here. So -2 times v will be -2v. And then -2 times -3, that's a negative times a negative. So, of course, a negative times a negative is a positive. So that's going to be a plus 6. And then I'm just going to rewrite the rest of the inequality. So now that we've gotten rid of those parentheses, we're going to solve it. And we're going to do it exactly the same way we would if it were an equation, by isolating that variable of v. So again, there's a few ways we could do this, but what most people are going to do is subtract the 6 first. So that's what we're going to do here. What you do to one side, of course, you have to do to the other. And remember that there's like that invisible line right there through the sign. So we're going to subtract 6 from both sides. And that will cancel the 6's. That will leave you with a negative 2v that you need to bring down. And here's where you need to be careful too. Negative 6 minus 6 is not 0. You were already negative, and then you went down 6 more, so that's actually negative 12. And then finally, you want to get rid of that negative 2. So the negative 2 sitting next to the v implies multiplication. You want to cancel that out by dividing both sides by negative 2. So that's going to cancel. Leave your v isolated exactly the way you wanted it to. Negative 12 divided by negative 6, or I'm sorry, negative 12 divided by negative 2 is going to be a positive 6. And if it were an equation, you would obviously write the equal sign, but that's not what we're doing here, right? We're not solving an equation, we're solving an inequality. So I'm going to look back up here and see that the original symbol was a greater than, so I'm going to bring that down. But I'm going to remember my rule about inequalities that says if you divide by a negative, which we did, again, that means that you need to flip the inequality symbol. So I'm going to change that from a greater than to a less than. And so this will be the final answer that you would type into the Google form if that's what you're doing.